Okay, fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining. We have a good attendance on this session. Obviously, Lighthouse is a hot topic for people. So we're gonna be talking about Lighthouse. We're gonna be running through a few of the features. I've got a few demos to do. We have 2 hours booked for this session. I don't think we'll need all the time, but we'll see how we go. Maybe with some questions, we'll see how we go through. I have actually also been, as part of the preparation for this session, I have actually been talking with the Azure Lighthouse team. One of the things we do in Opsagility, we obviously have some very deep contacts with Microsoft. From our, a lot of our staff, including myself, have a strong background with Microsoft. So we do get that opportunity to work directly with the Azure product group, and we have been talking to the Lighthouse team about some of the features, and they did ask for any feedback from this session. So if people have questions about Lighthouse or feedback about Lighthouse if they've been using it themselves, then do share it and feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the next slide, and like I say, we do have a direct channel with the Lighthouse team, and we're happy to pass on any feedback or questions that you may have. So with that, let's move ahead. Brief introduction, there's me. My name is Jonathan Tuliani. I'm the Managing Director in Europe for Opsagility, which is, we're the training experts behind skillmeup.com. As well as managing our European office, I do have a technical background, and I work on a number of our technical projects, building labs, building content, providing sessions like this, providing hands-on training in classes and so on. So I work at all those different things. I've been with Opsagility 2.5 years, give or take. Before that, I was nearly 10 years in Microsoft, where I spent most of those 10 years actually in the Azure product group. I used to be the program manager in the used to be a program manager in the networking team. I worked on the Azure DNS service, Azure Traffic Manager, and various other features. So before that, I have a background in software development and in the partner space, technical pre-sales, project management, you name it, various different things. We also write the exam reference for Microsoft, the AZ-103 exam reference. You'll see there the green book. That's written by Opsagility, and you'll see my name and that of a couple of my colleagues on the cover there. So I'm responsible for some parts of that book. So that's a bit about me. And what are we doing today then? So we're going to talk about Lighthouse, and we're going to start by just setting some context around how access control in Azure works. Nothing to do with Lighthouse, just a bit of a recap. Some of you will be familiar already, but it's a very important foundation for what then follows, where we explain what Lighthouse kind of layers on top of that in terms of providing access control to other organizations in an MSP style scenario. We'll talk about how you can get started with Lighthouse. We'll talk a bit about the permissions, and actually I'm missing a bullet on this slide. We're also going to talk about, having got everything set up, how you actually use Lighthouse. What can it do and what can it not do, and look at it. As I say, we'll do some demos as we go that will show you the key concepts. So without more ado, let's dive in and start with this recap of how access control works in Azure. Okay. Azure, when you work with Azure, you work with subscriptions, and obviously you have users. And the thing that links all of that together is Azure Active Directory. Your subscriptions are tied to your directory. Each subscription is associated with a particular directory. And also, of course, your users are members of the Azure Active Directory or tenant, as we call it. Sometimes you'll hear me talk about Azure AD directories, and sometimes you'll say Azure AD tenants, and basically that's the same thing. The tenant is your account in Active Directory, and it typically represents your organization. For most organizations, they will have one tenant that contains all of their users and all of their subscriptions. Occasionally, you do get organizations where you have multiple tenants in Azure AD. For example, in a large enterprise where they've done an acquisition of another company. Often they will consolidate those, but sometimes they don't. And Lighthouse can actually be used in multi-tenant scenarios within an organization where they do have multiple tenants. We're not going to talk heavily about that today, but it is a scenario for Lighthouse. We're going to focus on a different scenario, which is more the MSP scenario, where you have a partner that's managing a subscription on behalf of a customer. But we'll talk more about the scenario shortly. But in a traditional, single company world, this is the setup. You've got your users and your subscriptions linked via your Azure Active Directory tenant. You can invite guest users into your tenant to manage things on your behalf. Until Lighthouse came along, that could be a common way that a partner might work with a subscription that belongs to a customer. But the challenge with that is that the user on the partner side who's being invited as a guest, they still have to switch their view into the tenant of the customer. So they don't see the customer's subscription within their own tenant. They have to kind of switch. Okay, now I'm going to jump to the Contoso tenant, or now I'm going to jump to the Fabricam tenant, or whoever it is, whoever the customer is. You have to jump between the user is, if they're managing 10 different customers, they're jumping between 10 different tenants. They don't get an all-up view of things. So it works, but it has a lot of limitations. Our Lighthouse provides a much smoother experience and a much better way to work across multiple tenants, and we'll talk about that as we go. But this is the core concept, that the identity is coming from the tenant. And when you use Azure, you come through this interface called Azure Resource Manager. I'm not going to be talking about Azure Classic. Lighthouse doesn't work with Classic, so we'll ignore Classic for now. Whatever interface of Azure you're using, you can see across the top there, I've got Visual Studio, the Azure Portal, PowerShell, CLI, SDKs, whatever you're using, all your requests come through Azure Resource Manager. And Azure Resource Manager, each request will come with an authentication token, and Azure Resource Manager will use Azure AD to see, look, is this token legitimate? You know, is this a valid request? Does it come with a valid token? And that tells it who the caller is. And so it's like, okay, now I know this definitely came from Jim or Mary or whoever it was. You know, I know exactly who made this request. And then Azure Resource Manager has these things, this system called role-based access control, but built out of these things called role definition and role assignments. And role-based access control allows Azure Resource Manager to determine, Azure Resource Manager is able to determine from the role-based access control, okay, is Jim or Mary or whoever's made this request, are they authorized to perform this operation? Maybe they're deleting a VM, or maybe they're creating a storage account or modifying a virtual network, or whatever they're doing. Are they allowed to do this thing that they've asked to do? And then the Azure Resource Manager will say yay or nay. And if it's a no, it will just reject the request. And if it's a yes, it passes that request on to the underlying resource providers. And there's many resource providers. The slide says 50 plus, but I think it's probably more like 100 by now. There's many resource providers, not just from Microsoft, but also third parties there. So that's the long and short of how this works. You have a role-based access control containing the authorization and using authentication from Azure AD. And that's why, of course, the users must be in Azure AD for all this to work. Great. Do feel free to drop questions into the chat if you have any questions. So an important concept in Azure, and you'll have seen this many times when you use Azure, is the idea of a resource ID. And there's an example there for a storage account. You see it talks about the subscription and the resource group and the resource type and the resource name and so on. You have this thing called a resource ID, and many of you will be familiar with this. This is a typical resource ID. There's a few special cases where you have resource IDs that sometimes take a slightly different format, but the key thing is that the tenant ID, and by tenant I mean that account in Azure Active Directory, you know, that represents your organization. The tenant ID is not part of the resource ID. That's a very key point. The tenant ID basically is inferred from the identity of the caller that's making the request. You can kind of tell which tenant it is by the person calling the request. And of course, the subscription ID is also globally unique, so that also implies which tenant that subscription is associated with. So the tenant ID is not explicitly part of the resource IDs. It's not explicitly passed over the API when you say I want to modify this VM or modify that storage account. You're not saying it's within this subscription within this tenant. You kind of implicitly allow the tenant to be provided, as part of the context of the call that you're making. There was a question just there, which I'm just going to pull out, and it says, "Can an admin merge tenants on their own?" There are some facilities to where an organization has gone through a merger and they have multiple tenants. You can move subscriptions between tenants. You can do that on your own. Merging tenants, whether that can be done on your own or via support, I don't know. We'd have to dig into that one. That's a question we'd have to take offline, whether merging tenants can be done on your own. Obviously you can migrate users from one to another and give them new user IDs in the new tenant, and obviously that could be scripted and done in bulk. But in terms of merging, that's something I would have to consult on, take advice on. So that's a question we can follow up offline with. A great question, though. Thank you. And it does happen that organizations going through mergers do have to deal with problems like that. It's a well-trodden path. Okay, let's carry on. Okay, so we got the idea that the tenant ID is not explicitly given in the resource IDs or in the APIs. It's just part of the context of the person making the call and so on. Okay, we got that. Okay. That gives us our background on the Azure AD, RBAC, and so on. So now let's talk about Lighthouse. So let's look at the problem first of all that Lighthouse is designed to challenge. So you're a partner. you're managing a large number of different customers, maybe 100 customers. I mean, 1,000 it says on the slide, but that's maybe a slightly high number. But certainly 50 or 100 customers is perfectly possible for a large partner to be managing. And you may be providing a whole bunch of services there for those partners, cost optimization, monitoring, backup, site recovery, you name it, just monitoring the health of their resources, checking for the standard things, are the disks full, are the VMs the right size, and various different things, networking configured correctly, reviewing things for security, keeping Azure Advisor green, various different services that service providers provide for their customers. And if you want to do that across 50 or 100 tenants, that can be a bit of a headache, because if you use Azure B2B collaboration, well, then you're switching tenants the whole time. How do you get an all-up view of what's hot and what's not? What needs to be done? You end up having to build an awful lot of automation and dashboards of your own. Using B2B collaboration isn't really going to work here. For a start, with B2B collaboration, you have to your guest accounts in the customer's tenant are done at the user level. So it's I invite a user to my tenant. But now Jim leaves the team and we hire a new guy called Phil. What are we going to do? We have to go to 50 customers and say, okay, please invite this new guy, Phil. And we have 20 people in our team that manages these customer accounts. So they have to have 20 guests, and people come and go, and it's a nightmare. It doesn't make sense to manage things at an individual level. But that's all B2B collaboration support. So you can't add a group. You're obviously switching context all the time between the directories, and you never get an all-up view. So you can't see an aggregated, dashboard of everything that's going on without building it yourself, basically. And if you have some automation, a lot of partners, they do invest very heavily in automation to streamline these processes. And of course, automation will also need an account and permissions to run under, and that's typically a service principal account. And that account faces all the same challenges we just talked about. Is how does it get access? How do you manage that access over time? There really isn't a good solution to this until Lighthouse came along. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to say, how can we efficiently allow a partner to manage resources across multiple tenants? So this is what Lighthouse does. The picture kind of explains it. The picture shows the customer tenant. That's the blue pyramid. They own the subscription. And what it does is Lighthouse fundamentally, it allows the MSP, the managed service provider, a different tenant, to also manage that same subscription. And what it effectively does is it projects the customer subscription into the MSP's tenant. So now that subscription is visible from both tenants. So the MSP, well, they've got their users on the MSP tenant, but because of this projection, now the MSP user from within the MSP tenant can now manage the customer subscription, or subscriptions. It could be multiple subscriptions across multiple customers. They're all being projected into the MSP, and the MSP within that one tenant gets an all-up view across all of these subscriptions, across all of these customers, because they're seeing this projected image of the subscription in their tenant. That's the key concept. So it's this projection of the subscription into your MSP tenant. That's the key thing. As we mentioned, this can also be used in a different context of an enterprise with multiple AAD tenants. But we're going to talk in this, I'm going to use this language of the customer and the MSP. So the subscription is kind of native to the customer tenant, but it's being managed from the MSP tenant. And you're going to see me talk about that language as we go through this material. There's a question there. I'm just reading the question. It says, I can imagine there are millions of API calls for the various resources. Is there any prioritization in place for more important operations? I assume Lighthouse API calls are more important than MSDN subscriptions, for example. I'm not really aware of any subscriptions there. I think the way Azure works is it's just built to scale and handle all the requests that come in. And you're absolutely right that there are millions of API calls coming through Azure Resource Manager every day, every hour even. There's huge volumes coming through, but it is built to scale. Azure Resource Manager is deployed geographically around every Azure region. So obviously you're routed it actually uses Azure Traffic Manager to route to your nearest Resource Manager instance. And within that, they have a cluster of Resource Manager endpoints. And the service is basically designed to scale. All API calls should go through. There are some things that are resource intensive in Azure, such as, let me think of an example, computing a compliance report on a policy, for example. And those tend to happen offline rather than in line with a particular API request. They happen as a background task, and that, so things that are expensive get pushed out to background tasks rather than being, synchronously as part of an API call where they can put heavy load on the system. But in general, yeah, the APIs should cope. I hope that answers the question. That was a question from Andrew. Thank you. Good question. What else does Lighthouse enable? So enables this streamlined management, and from a partner point of view, it really creates two big scenarios. One is this idea of MSP services, and that's the main one I'm going to talk about. This is where an MSP is managing a customer tenant, on the customer's behalf, a customer subscription on their behalf, doing all those backup and housekeeping tasks that the customer doesn't want to do for themselves. Another scenario is managed applications, and this is where the partner is, rather than just offering a managed service, is really like an ISV scenario. They've got an application that they want to sell to the customer effectively. The customer is going to run the application in the customer subscription, but the partner is going to manage the application for them. Maybe there's some patching that needs to be done, deploying updates, whatever. The customer is just going to use the application. The customer is going to pay for the consumption. So it enables a ISV to roll out their application without having to think about the consumption side of it, because it's running in the customer subscription that the customer pays for. But the MSP has the ability to manage the application. So that's what Lighthouse is providing, is that management window, that projection that allows the MSP to manage the application even though it's deployed to the customer subscription. Managed applications actually do something else as well, which is that they allow the application to be kind of magically locked in a way that stops the customer messing it up. It stops the customer kind of getting in there with their dirty fingers and doing things that the MSP will then have to unscramble later. So that's managed applications. Maybe that would be a great topic for another talk, another day, actually, to talk about managed applications. But for now, we're going to focus on the access piece that the MSP needs into the Azure subscription. Super. Let's keep going. Okay, so this is the key concept, is this idea of delegated access, that the subscription is projected into the additional tenant. So users in the MSP's tenant, they can manage resources across these subscriptions without switching from their home directory. They just see this view. And you can see on the right here, and I'll do a demo, you see on the right there that this is just showing the standard subscription filter that you have when you click in that little filter button in the top of your Azure portal, and you get to choose which, if you have multiple directories, you get to choose which directory and so on you're using. And you can see here where I have a delegation in place, instead of just listing my directories, it says current and delegated directories. You see that here, and here you get, from this first drop down, you can choose which directory to use. You'll see it when I do a demo. And then from your subscriptions, you get this breakdown. It says, look, I have all these different subscriptions. This user is in the Contoso directory, and they get to see the Azure Pass subscription here. That's actually their own subscription. And then they also get to see this Azure Pass subscription, which is from a completely different directory, the Fabricam directory. They can select both of these. I want to see both of these at once, and they could have a list of 50 subscriptions here, perhaps. So this is really showing you how you just get this multi-tenant view that you can just pick. Yeah, give me this subscription and this one and this one and this one. Beautiful. It works very, very well. So we'll see that as we do some demos. What can you do? Common scenarios for this. Obviously, I mean, once you have this, it's very powerful. You can do anything in Azure, more or less. We'll talk about some limitations later, but there aren't many limitations. You can basically manage anything through this. And Azure, the documentation does list out some kind of common scenarios that MSPs offer as services. There's a link on the slide, and some of them are listed here on the slide. So things like backup and site recovery, making sure that those are running cleanly, that they're set up correctly, that they work. Monitoring activities, making sure that you're picking up alerts and checking, just keep things healthy, just proactive monitoring, making sure that things continue to operate well. Policy and governance services, so you're putting in place good policies to make sure that you have reduced the risk. People aren't able to deploy crazy expensive resources, and you're reviewing the compliance reports to make sure that people have the tags in place that you're using for billing or for identifying different environments or whatever you're using tags for. So just making sure that governance piece is being done correctly. Very important in Azure. If you're going to do Azure at any kind of scale, you need the governance to be done well. Otherwise, you end up in a mess, basically. Operations, and this is the key. This is a very interesting part here. Suppose you are, as the partner, the MSP, you've automated some of your tasks. Part of your value proposition is that you've automated various management tasks that you're able to then offer as a service to the customer that you're charging for. But that's been a big investment in IP for you, all that automation. You've actually made a very substantial investment there, and you want to protect that IP. You don't want to just leak copies of your automation to everybody. And that works very nicely here, because the automation can run under your own accounts, where it's not visible to the customer. That's where your actual automation can sit. But the automation can still access the customer's subscriptions. Of course, it needs the right permissions, and you manage those. We'll talk about how the permissions work as part of this talk. But given your automation has the correct permissions to access the customer's subscriptions, then your automation can go across that tenant boundary, protecting your IP, but still delivering the value. So that's a very nice arrangement. Obviously, other things here, keeping track of Security Center and Azure Advisor, keeping all of that green and giving, visibility and management there. And also just managing applications. You could be managing VMs, setting things up for the customer, setting up their networking, setting up their app services, whatever it is, whatever it is, you can be doing it for the customer in the customer's subscription this way. This all works. That gives you the scenarios. Let's keep going and let's look at how you can actually get started with this and use it. So how do you actually do this? How do you get this working? How do you get it set up? So there's two ways to enroll in Lighthouse. So two kind of parallel paths. Under the hood, they're kind of doing the same thing, and I'll explain what's happening under the hood. But let's make sure we understand the two ways. So the first is via the marketplace. And this is where the MSP publishes a managed services offer to the marketplace. So they're saying, okay, I'm going to offer my services. Well, I'll go into some detail and I'll do a demo of I'll show you the screens and so on. But fundamentally, that basically says, look, I'm the MSP. This is my tenant that I want to see your subscription in, and these are the permissions I'm going to need in order to do the management I want to do. So that's basically the guts of their offer. And the customer can then browse the marketplace and say, oh yeah, this looks like a good offer, and I trust these guys. I've met with these guys, and the customer signs up and accepts that offer and deploys the MSP offer to their subscription, and then the customer, or to their tenant, if you like, and then the customer then chooses, okay, well, which subscriptions do I want this MSP to manage? Because the customer can choose. They might have 5 subscriptions and they only want the MSP to manage 2 of them, and that's totally okay. Lighthouse supports that. And the customer can even say, okay, well, I have this subscription, but I only want the MSP to manage these resource groups. I don't want them to manage everything in the subscription. I want to scope it down to a selection of resource groups, and that's possible. The customer can choose the scope, either subscription or resource group, that is delegated to the MSP. So that's all fine. That's with this MSP publishing this offer. The second way that this can be done is nothing to do with the marketplace. It's forget about the marketplace. You don't need the marketplace for this. In this case, you still have the two organizations, the MSP and the customer, but the customer is going to simply deploy a template that contains the MSP's details. The same details that the MSP published in the marketplace, it's just that the marketplace isn't involved this time. So it's the same thing happening under the hood, but just that nothing went through the marketplace to get there. So the customer deploys a template containing all of these details of the MSP, saying, I delegate to this guy. And then it just works. And we'll look at that method as well. Okay. So for the marketplace piece, this is where the partner is selling this offer from the marketplace. So the first thing the partner needs to do is they need to enroll. Obviously, they need to be a Microsoft partner. They need to register as a partner. They need a partner ID. They need an account in Partner Center. And there's various different programs in Partner Center that you can enroll into. And in this case, to be in the marketplace, you need to enroll into what's called the Commercial Marketplace program. So great, you enroll with that, and there's going to be some hoops to jump through for you to be a member of that program. Once you're a member of that program, you can then create what's called a managed services offer. There's lots of other offer types you can also make through that program, but what you need for this is to create this managed service offer. And you do that right now through this portal called cloudpartner.azure.com, but that's changing. That's going to start migrating into the core Partner Center site from the end of this month. So that is going to move. But you have the link in the normal Partner Center site already. At the moment, that link just kicks you out to the Cloud Partner site, and that's, I guess, is going to be integrated. And within that information, you provide the information that's basically shown on the screen there. And I'll do a demo of this as well. So you provide just the name and description and so on, and you provide a billing model. And that can be a bring your own license model, or it can be a percentage of the consumption. So the bring your own license just means that you're billing the customer out of band, and Microsoft has nothing to do with it. And then you can also charge a percentage of the Azure consumption. And then you also have the ability to say a plan is public or private. So if it's a public plan, it's in the marketplace for everyone to see. If it's a private plan, then you have to list out here as part of your marketplace offer. You say, these are the subscriptions that are able to purchase this plan. So of course, you'll need to know what your customer subscriptions are. You say, okay, these are the subscriptions that are going to have access. And then only users within those subscriptions will be able to see that offer and purchase it. And this is ideal, of course, when you're doing your own private development and testing, and it's also ideal for the enterprise scenario where you have where you're not an MSP but just an enterprise wanting to streamline management across more than one tenant. That's where they can use this private plan, so it works very well for that. So they list out their subscription IDs, and then you have to state, as the partner, you have to state, okay, if I'm going to take this on for you, these are the permissions I need. And we'll talk about the permissions in more detail, but there's the second screenshot there, the bottom of the slide, gives an example where you basically say, this is the identity I'm going to give the permissions to, and that can be an individual user, or it could be a group, and a group is recommended here. So this could be your support team, for example, or it could be your security team, or your governance team, or your cost optimization team, or whoever they are, whatever service you're providing, the team that's going to do this stuff for the customer. You say, look, this is the group that I want to give permissions to, and then you say, these are the permissions I want, and you say, okay, I want them to be a contributor or a VM administrator or whatever it is. And you can have multiple permissions. You can ask for not just one set of permissions, but multiple sets. And we'll go through that in a bit more detail. So once you've set this plan up, you then publish. And there's a review process here. It goes published as a preview where you can give it a try, and there's a few hoops to jump through. But at the end of the day, once it's been published, and that could take several days, then it's available in the marketplace for the customer to pick up. So that should be straightforward. Let's have a look at that. I'm just going to switch over to this window, and here I am in Partner Center. And you see here, I've got these different offers that I'm signed up to here, and here's the commercial marketplace offer. And I just click new offer, and this is a managed service offer. And this kicks me out to this cloudpartner.azure.com site. As I said, this one is going away and being merged into Partner Center. So I just choose my account. And here you can see I've got all my offers, and I can create a new offer and so on. So here, if I look at all offers, I've got an existing one that I've been, it isn't published, but it's available here just to see the different settings. So within an offer, you have various plans, but typically you just have a single plan in an offer. So you have the offer says, okay, it has this offer ID and a publisher ID and so on. And then you create a plan within the offer. And as I say, you can have more than one, but typically you just have the one plan. And the plan describes, just the actual offer that a bit more detail about what it is that you're offering. So you say, look, here's a title for the plan. Maybe it's your silver level of managed service offering, or your gold level service provision, or your backup management offer, or whatever it is. You describe the plan here. You specify the billing model. It could be a percentage of consumption or bring your own license. Is it private or not? If you make it public, then that's a one-way trip. So if you publish a plan with a public, you can't then make it private. And you say whether the audience is if it's private, you list out the subscriptions IDs who are going to use it. And then you have these various permissions that you request. You say, okay, for this particular user, or this particular group, I want the contributor permissions. And for this group or this user, I want resource policy contributor. You'll notice that contributor can't manage policy. If you're familiar with how RBAC works and how policy works, the contributor role can't manage policy. So if you want to be able to manage policy on the customer's behalf, hey, it makes sense to have the policy a policy role as well, and so on. There's some special permissions around user access administrator, which I'm going to talk about later, so I won't go into that in detail here, but that's a bit of a special case, and we'll talk more about these on a later slide. So you specify your permissions, and then there's a few other details you need to make at the offer level. You're going to have some descriptions, and you upload icons for your thing so it looks nice and pretty in the marketplace portal. There's contact information and so on. So this is all part of the offer that you make, and then you publish the offer to the customer. Great stuff. Okay, so now let's have a look at what happens next. So you've published to the customer. The customer is going to buy it out of the marketplace. So I'll show you how to do it, how to navigate in the portal. They come into the portal, and they go into the service providers. They choose your offer. Hooray! They like yours more than the others, and they will provide some contact details. So as their partner, you can give them a call and talk to them about their purchase and what services they want you to provide. They will review the access permissions. Remember, when you published your offer, you had to give you listed out the permissions that you were requesting. You said, okay, I need reader permissions and contributor permissions and whatever it was. So the customer is obviously going to get to review those before they hand over their subscription to you, because they might not be happy with those. and they're going to obviously accept some terms, and it's worth having a little look at these. By checking the box and clicking create, I give permission for the offer provider referenced above to have access to one or more Azure resources. In the event of an issue arising from the provider's services or failure to provide services, your sole recourse is with the provider. Unless Microsoft is the provider, Microsoft does not approve, monitor, manage the provider's access and bears no responsibility. So if the provider goes and spins up a €5,000 VM or an $80,000 express route connection or whatever, it's between you and the provider. Yeah, that's the long and short of it. Yeah, Microsoft is not on the hook for this. It's you know, the provider, if you're giving them permission to create resources, well, they can create resources, right? So you know, there is a trust relationship here. Obviously, you accept these terms, and then you click create. You click the blue button, and boom, it's up and running. The second step is you need to choose. Okay, what that does is it's created a relationship with the provider for that subscription. But what you then have to choose is say, look, am I giving them the whole subscription, or am I just going to give them certain resource groups? And that's what you can do here with this second step. Once you've done that first part, you come as a customer, again, you're in the Azure portal, and you get to choose this. You get to do this step called delegate resources, and I'll show you in a demo, where you get to say, okay, I'm going to hand over the subscription or just this resource group, and you get to delegate these resources over to the provider. And again, you have the similar set of conditions there that you know, on the slide there, that show that you trust the provider to have this permission. Let's have a look in our demo. So let me do this. So this is how the provider did their publishing. We saw that. Let's go into this account here. So here I'm in the Contoso directory. You can see JRT Labo 1. This user is in the Contoso directory. You see that at the top here. I might just zoom this a touch so you can see it a little better. Okay, so here we are in the Contoso directory. Fantastic. The service here to access the Lighthouse service, to give permission to the provider, you use this service called Service Providers. I've used it recently, so it's sitting in my recently used list at the top here. Otherwise, you can just search at the top, Service Providers. There it is. So go into Service Providers, and here's just an overview. But if we go service provider offers, or one of the buttons on that overview page, we can add an offer. So this is going to take us, if we click add an offer, this takes us to the marketplace where we see all these different offers that are available. And you can have a browse of these different offers that are being suggested. There's a few test ones here that kind of litter the landscape a bit. You see, you know, Equinix optimized WAN workshop, optimization assessment, you know, standard managed service. You know, there's various different providers here that are offering their services through this portal. There was one I was playing with earlier. I don't advocate any particular provider, but there's this managed service assessment from Fujitsu. Let's have a look at this one. And if we click on it, you can see, okay, there's an overview here of a description. I can click on the plan, and you can see some of this. Okay, let's create this. And I get to choose which of my subscriptions I'm going to use. Choose a region, doesn't make any difference what region you use. Give it a name, and you know, review and create. So let's do that. And oh yeah, there's some details I need to fill in. My contact details, I was saying it needed. There's my email address, and you also need to give it a phone number. They're going to let me get away with that. And here also you get to review, before you do the create, you get to review the access permissions. So these are the permissions that Fujitsu in this case was requesting as part of this offer. And this one is just read access. They're offering the read access here so that they can read my subscription. Not going to be able to do stuff for me, they're just going to be able to read. And then there's this one here, assessment remove access. I'll explain this a little bit more later, what this one means. This is one that all providers should include on their assessment, and I'll explain why later. We're going to come to that in a little while. But basically, this offer is they're just going to be reading stuff. They're not going to be able to change anything, which is why it's great for demos. Okay, so I got to accept the conditions, and then I will be able to create. I should be able to. Is anything missing on this one? No, there we go. View and create. View and create. Create. There we go. And this will submit the deployment, and it will create a resource that represents that relationship I'm creating with, in this case, Fujitsu. So, so we'll let that go through. It's very quick. It doesn't take long. Okay, so that's great. And you can see here in the service providers, my service provider offers is now there. So now I have a link with UK Fujitsu. But they can't actually access any of my subscriptions until I do the next stage, which is this one where I go to delegations on the left, on the left here, and I add a delegation. So here I can actually say a delegation. I choose which provider, because I may use multiple providers, and I can even use multiple providers on the same subscription. But in this case, I've only got the one provider. It was Fujitsu, and it was which of their particular plans was it? It was this one here. And now I can choose, maybe it's just a particular resource group I want to choose. I'm going to give them access to this resource group, migration RG. So there we go. And again, accept the terms and delegate. So then Fujitsu would be able to read anything in that particular migration RG. They'll be able to see whatever's in there. Now I've given them access to that tenant, to that resource group in my tenant, and they'll be able to access that from their tenant. Oh, and in this case, actually, I don't have the correct permissions, so that's why it's failed here. I'm going to talk about permissions in a second, but this particular user, JRT Lab 01, doesn't have the correct permissions, which is why it hasn't worked. So there we go. Okay, perfect. So let's go back and look at this again. Okay, so we talked about this process, the delegation process, and so on. Okay, that's all fine. Okay, so what happened under the hood there? I always find with Azure that you need, if you really want to understand what's happening, you need to get under the hood and you need to look at the APIs, look at the resources, and understand what's happening at that kind of resource level. And there's two resources involved with Lighthouse. One is called the registration definitions, and the other is called the registration assignments. And they both live in the Microsoft.managed services resource provider. So the registration definitions, that was what we did first. When we made the purchase from the marketplace, that's what was created. The registration definition was created. So that creates the relationship with the service provider, and that's your marketplace purchase. And this contains all those details we talked about. There's the name and description, the tenant ID of the MSP, the authorizations, so the permissions that we're granting, and the details of the plan if it's been done through the marketplace. And then the registration assignment, that was the second step. When I was in the portal and I delegated to say, okay, yeah, you can have access to this resource group and this resource group or this subscription. That second bit, that was where we created a registration assignment. I actually failed because of an error, but ignoring that. The registration assignment is the thing that actually provides access to a particular scope. So the registration definition on its own really doesn't do anything. It's just saying, look, I want to work with this provider. And the registration assignment is where you turn around and say, yes, this is the scope that I want the provider to have access to. This is the where they're going to be working in this subscription or this resource group. And then it's, things are in business at that point. And that's a resource that you create at that scope that you're delegating. So the scope at which you create that resource is very important. So it will sometimes be at subscription scope, or it may be at resource group scope. We'll come to that in a moment. And this thing doesn't have much in the way of properties. The only property within it is the link to the registration definition. That's it. So that's that. Okay. Why do I spend so long talking about the registration definitions and registration assignments? You can do all this just by clicking about in the portal, right? You don't need to know about these crazy resource types under the hood. Well, the reason this is important is because, as I said, there's a second way to do your Lighthouse deployment, and that is where you forget about the marketplace and you do it all from a template instead. And in the template, you're going to see these resource types. What you're going to do in your template is basically deploy these guys, your registration definition and your registration assignment. And that's why it's important to know how they work. So to do this, firstly, you may need to register the managed services resource provider with your subscription. That can be done by the command line or through the portal. Just search for register resource provider in Azure and you'll find the instructions for that. So you may need to do that registration step. And then you're going to deploy these two resources directly, the registration definition and the registration assignment. And the definition can refer to any tenant, any Azure AD tenant. It doesn't have to be someone who's using the marketplace. It can be anyone. So this is where your enterprise scenario works for it very well. And this is how I've done my demo. I've got a demo that has this working, just deployed from a tenant. I'll show you the template I deployed shortly. So it's not tied to any marketplace offer. You can deploy to anyone. All you need to know is you need to know the MSPs or the tenant that's going to be granted access. I think of them as the MSP, but it could be anyone. You need to know their tenant ID. And you also get to choose here as part of that definition resource, that first part, you get to choose what permissions you're going to grant. So as long as you have their tenant ID, the GUID that represents their Active Directory tenant, their AAD tenant, and then you can grant permissions to them. And to grant permissions, you're going to need to know the GUIDs for the object IDs of some identity within their directory, either a user or a group or service principal or whatever it is, the entity that you're granting the permission to, and then you get to choose what roles you're granting. And this template with the registration definition and the registration assignments, these are deployed into the customer subscription, and it's a subscription level deployment. So, well, the definition is a subscription level deployment. The assignment may be subscription or may be resource group level, depending on what level of scope you're assigning permission to. But that means, though, that the actual deployment will have to be done through PowerShell or CLI. You can't deploy at the subscription level just using the portal template deployment feature. You're stuck with doing it at a different level. You're stuck with doing it from the command line tools because it's subscription level deployment. And as I say, these are all customer actions. The only thing the MSP needs to do is give you the tenant ID. Once they've given you that tenant ID, you can just do this. The MSP can't stop you. You can just do it. You deploy this thing into your subscription, and it gives them access. It's all on the customer side. The action is all on the customer side. Okay, let's get ready. Let's talk a little bit about the permissions required to do this, because that's a key piece. Is everything making sense for everyone so far? Let me know if there's any questions or if there's anything that's not clear. Okay, super. We're all good up by the looks of it. Let's talk about the permissions, because this is an important topic. Okay, so the MSP, in order to set this up in the marketplace, if they're going with the marketplace route, they will need to enroll in the commercial marketplace program. Obviously, they'll need to have the appropriate permissions within their partner account to do the enrollment, and admin permissions. And also, they will need to be a silver or gold cloud platform partner. They'll need the silver or gold cloud platform competency in order to be accepted into the commercial marketplace program. So that is the first step, is get enrolled in the program. And then, once you're in the marketplace, obviously you'll be able to, publish the offer that I showed you. When the customer signs up and says, yeah, I want to be your customer, what does the MSP do? Well, the MSP does nothing, right? It's all on the customer side. As I said, what's happening is those two resources are being deployed, and they're both deployed on the customer side. So there is no action on the MSP side to accept a customer. You kind of automatically accepted. The customer automatically falls into the MSP's tenant, if you like. All the action is on the customer side. However, it may be that the MSP doesn't want to work with a particular customer. They think, no, I don't want to, Fujitsu are going to look at me doing this demo and say, no, I don't want that guy in my directory, get him out. And I'll delete the registration with Fujitsu in a moment. But the ability for the MSP to remove the customer is very important, because again, the resources are in the customer's subscription. So if I, as a customer, register with a particular MSP, for the MSP to get rid of me, they need the right permissions to remove those two resources from my subscription. And that's where this particular role, remember on the Fujitsu one, there was two roles that they asked for. They asked for reader role, and they also asked for this managed services registration assignment delete role, which is a bit of a mouthful. But there's this particular role that is designed that as part of your MSP offer, you should always include to say, I want permission for this role, because this is the role that allows you to get rid of a customer. That allows you to say, look, when the customer gives me access, through that access, I will have the ability to delete the assignment resource, the second of those two resources that we talked about. I'll be able to delete that assignment resource from the customer's subscription, thereby unlisting this customer because I don't want to work with them anymore. So that permission is very important. If you give permission to the MSP, if you sign up, if a customer enrolls with an MSP without giving that permission, then the MSP is kind of stuck with them. The MSP can't by themselves get rid of them. I mean, they could probably raise a support ticket to do it or something, but there's no self-service mechanism unless the MSP has the permissions. There's a question just come through. It says, if the customer has multiple subscriptions, do they have to deploy these resources into each subscription they have? Yes, this is their subscription scope. Certainly the assignment is a subscription scope. It's a good question whether you have to do the definition on every subscription. I'm going to park that one and come back to me on that one. You have my email from the earlier slide, or Tuliani@opportunity.com. But certainly, yes, the delegation is every subscription or resource group, if you want to do it at the resource group level. That's the registration delegation. The assignment, I believe, is also in every subscription, but I will check on that one because I could be wrong on that one. So let me find out for sure on the first one, the registration definition, and I can come back on that if you ping me offline. Super. On the customer side, let's look at the permissions there. The customer is going to be purchasing this thing out of the marketplace. And effectively, that means they're going to be creating this registration definitions resource. And this is tied to the owner role. You might look at it and think, well, I just need permissions for Microsoft.managed services, whack registration definitions, whack right. For those who are familiar with how Azure RBAC works, you would look at that and think, well, that's the resource type I'm creating. That's the permission I need. And you can go and create a custom role that contains that permission, and you can grant it to the user, and you can get that user to log in and try to do this process, and it doesn't work. And that's because it's actually kind of hard linked into the owner role specifically. So you must be an owner in order to sign up. So that's how that is set up today. It's an interesting topic, and it's something that I think the product group are interested in feedback around. Is this, but at the moment it's tied specifically to the owner group, and likewise to do the delegation is also tied to the owner role. You have to be a subscription owner in order to do this. It doesn't work just based on that specific RBAC permission in a custom role. So that's a key role, a key part of the setup. Okay, so now the customer has done their piece and the MSP has done their piece, and the MSP is then wants to actually manage stuff in the customer. That's the whole point, right? Is the MSP can manage things in the customer subscription. So here, what permissions does the MSP have? Well, they have the ones that they asked for. The registration definition, their marketplace offer, lists out their permissions. Remember, we saw that in the demo. We say, look, these are the permissions I want, and that's kind of a one-time thing. It would be up to the customer to change the registration definition to add more permissions later if they need to, but those permissions are basically fixed at the time they sign up. So it's important that your MSP offer contains the correct permissions, that you're careful about what permissions you include there. So you list those out, and typically you'll ask for them to be assigned to a group, which you can then put your users in for your support team or whoever it is on the partner side. You give that team a display name that's shown in the portal and so on, and you specify what role it should have. It should be a contributor, or it should be a network contributor, or whatever it's supposed to be. You can also assign, if you're using automation, you may want to assign permissions to a service principal, which is the service principal that's used by your automation account or by your whatever other automation it is, Azure Functions, that is working on the customer's behalf. So you may need quite a few different permissions here for different automation accounts, different groups, different teams, and so on. As we've already said, always include the managed services registration assignment delete role, because otherwise you won't be able to get rid of the customer. So that's important to remove the delegation. And also there's a page in the portal for the MSPs called the My Customers page, and we'll look at that. And to use that page, then you need the reader role. But generally speaking, you're going to need something with equivalent permissions to reader anyway. If you can't read, you can't do much. So that is the permissions that you should include in your delegation. Some limitations. In your delegation, the permissions you can request, in your MSP offer that the customer signs up for, or that the customer can include in their delegation resource, you can only use built-in roles. You can't use custom roles, so it's built-in roles only. That's the first restriction. And it has to be the Azure RBAC roles. You can't use the old classic admin roles, forget about those. And that's something to mention back here, actually. We said on this page that the customer must be the owner. And I do mean an owner here. If you are the legacy, service admin, the classic service admin, whilst that is kind of equivalent to an owner role, it's not the owner role. You will need to, from the service admin role, you'll need to grant yourself owner role, and then this will work. It won't work without the owner role. Okay, so limitations. Some roles you may be familiar include something called data actions, and those roles are not supported. Most roles just include things called actions and not actions, and that's all fine. But there are some roles have special things called data actions, and this is an example would be accessing key vaults. There's some roles that access key vault, and we'll talk more about why the data actions don't work in a couple of slides time. So I'm going to come back to that topic. So roles with data actions, forget about those. They're not going to work. And you can't assign the owner role. You can't, as the MSP, say, I want to be the owner of the customer's subscription. That's really the customer's business, because owner is a bit too powerful. You are not allowed as the MSP to acquire the owner role. And that means you have to be very careful with the user access administrator role, because the user access administrator can be used to grant permissions. Now, this is a tricky one, because suppose I, as the partner, the MSP, I am going to manage policy on behalf of my customer. And those of you who are familiar with policy will be aware that it doesn't just use to restrict what you can do. I mean, that's the most common scenario, to say you can't do this, you can't do that, but it can do a lot more than that. And in particular, there are some policies that support deploying additional resources or modifying tags. And those also support remediation, where you can say, okay, find the resources that don't have the tags, the ones that are missing these tags, and go fix them. And to do that, the policy engine needs to actually make changes to existing resources, and that has to be done under an account. And it uses a managed identity for that, and that managed identity has to be given the correct permissions. Wow, that's a long story, right? So at the end of the day, the policy engine needs to be able to grant these permissions, or the person deploying the policy needs to be able to grant permissions to the managed identity. And you have a similar story if you're using blueprints. Again, you'd need to be able to grant permissions to the identity. So there are some cases where the managing partner needs to be able to grant permissions to managed identities for, it could be managed identities that are being used by applications, it could be policy, it could be blueprints, many different situations. So we don't want the partner to be able to grant more permissions than the ones the customer signs up for initially. That's visible to the customer, and it's kind of a contract, if you like. Say, look, these are the permissions, no more. But they do need some ability to grant permissions, and this is how it works. You can give the partner user access administrator permissions, and the user access administrator can grant permissions. So now great, the partner can grant permissions, but there are some limitations on what the partner can do. Firstly, they can only grant permissions for certain roles. As part of giving them permissions, as part of giving them user access administrator rights, you say, okay, you're not granting I'm giving you user access administrator, but you're not going to be able to just grant any role you like. You can only grant these roles. And you can say, okay, you're being able to grant VM administrator, or you're being able to grant a network administrator, but I'm not letting you grant other roles. So you limit which roles the user access administrator will be able to grant. And then the second thing you do is you say, okay, I'm also going to limit your ability to grant these roles only to managed identities. You cannot grant these permissions to users or to groups. So it's not going to be the humans. Only managed identities are required. So the MSP can grant permissions, but as I say, only as a customer, when you sign up, you get to see which permissions they'll be able to grant, and you understand that they'll only be to managed identities. So a bit of a complicated story there. Another thing, and this is just a limitation at the moment, it's something I do hope the product group addresses. As a customer, you may have resource locks in place on some of your resources, and when those resources are managed from the MSP side, from the through Lighthouse, those resource locks are not respected; they're ignored. So the MSP will be able to do things even though there's a lock in place, which is kind of strange, and it's something I think they hopefully will get fixed at some point. This only applies to the kind of traditional resource locks, the Microsoft Authorization WAC locks. If you have ever used managed applications or blueprints, you'll be aware that those also lock resources, but they do it in a completely different way. They use a deny assignment in RBAC, and those work just fine. There's no problem with those. So it's just the traditional resource locks don't get respected across the Lighthouse relationship. So that's something to just be aware of. If you're interested in more details on things like policy remediation or on blueprint locks and all of this, we have a learning path on Skill Me Up for deep dive in Azure governance, which goes into huge detail on these topics. So we have super deep dives on governance, including RBAC, policy, blueprints, you name it, as part of a Skill Me Up learning path, but enough. Okay, let's keep going. So let's have a little think about how we've got this set up. We did the permissions, we got everything set up, we have it working. Well, what can the partner now do? What can they actually do with this thing? The partner is going to be managing the delegated resources. How does that work? And I've just got a couple of slides here that explain some of the ins and outs of how that works. So the first thing to understand is a very important Azure concept, which is the difference between what we call the control plane and the data plane. When you work through Azure Resource Manager, you manage resources. You create VMs, you add subnets to your virtual network, whatever it is you're doing. And those are what we call control plane operations, where you're modifying the resource properties. You're creating resources and you're modifying resource properties. Great. But then many of these resources actually expose their own endpoints. So on a storage account, you get blob.core.windows.net and table.core.windows.net and so on. Or on a key vault, you get an endpoint, mykeyvault.keyvault.azure.com or whatever it is that where you manage secrets in your key vault. And you get from the networking team, you'd get from the network resource provider just a public IP address as an example of an endpoint here, a public IP address that you associate with one of your VMs or with a load balancer. Or on a website, there's an endpoint. So in some cases, those things are simply internet-facing endpoints that that are providing your service, such as the public IP address. But in some cases, they are really another kind of management endpoint. And they can be authenticated through Azure AD, so you can be managing blobs in blob storage or resources in Key Vault through those endpoints. And Lighthouse is very much a control plane feature. So you are able to access control plane operations through Lighthouse. But Lighthouse does not give access to those data plane endpoints, those resource provider endpoints. And this is why when we talked earlier about the different roles you were allowed, if I just go back 2 slides, you see here you can't assign roles to the MSP that use data actions. This is why, because the data actions, they'll be aligned with provider endpoints. Only the resource provider operations, the traditional actions that come through Resource Manager, through the control plane, that is the scope of what Lighthouse supports, which is most day-to-day resources. I mean, it's not a problem here, but it's just worth being aware of this distinction that it's strictly tied to the control plane. Okay, hopefully that's clear. Another thing is management groups. You'll be familiar, again, it's part of the Azure Governance Learning Path where we do a deep dive on management groups, but hopefully you're familiar with the concept of a management group. And this is a hierarchy of buckets, if you like, management groups that you can organize your subscriptions into. If you are a customer and you have a large number of subscriptions, you can organize them into a hierarchy called a management group hierarchy, and the root of the hierarchy is your Azure AD tenant. So the hierarchy is really implemented within at a tenant level. It's available to all subscriptions within your tenant. It's a tenant level concept. So the hierarchy is great because it allows you as a customer to assign policy and RBAC and so on at the management group scope, and therefore apply that policy across many subscriptions in one go, which is great. So you can still do all of that as a customer. The fact that you've put a subscription into Lighthouse doesn't change that. You can, as a customer, use your management group hierarchy within your tenant, and all of that just works in the normal way. You can get rolled up cost reporting across multiple subscriptions and so on. Everything works. Nothing gets broken because you use Lighthouse. From an MSP point of view, basically none of this works. So firstly, you don't have any visibility into the customer's management group hierarchy. You can only see the customer's subscriptions. The customer, when they created those delegations, they delegated a scope, which was either a subscription or resource group. So nothing above that is visible to you, which means there may be policy assigned at a management group level within the customer tenant, which is affecting a subscription that you as a partner are managing, but you can't see the policy because the policy is sitting above the scope that you can see. So that's something to be aware of, is that there may be some invisible policies that bite you. So just be aware of that. The MSP, they only have visibility at the subscription down. They don't see the customer's management group hierarchy. But secondly, the MSP, of course, is working within their own tenant. The MSP's tenant, where they have their own subscriptions as well as the customer subscriptions. And of course, they have their own management group hierarchy. The MSP has their own hierarchy they can build within their tenant. Now, within the MSP's tenant, they can only include their own MSP subscriptions. You cannot, as an MSP, put a projected subscription, a customer subscription, into your MSP management group hierarchy. That's not supported. So these subscriptions are really just a flat list of subscriptions from the customers. You can't hierarchy them in any way as a partner. So everything is all your management is going to have to be at the subscription or resource group level. There's no management group hierarchy available from a partner point of view, either on the customer tenant or your tenant. That makes it interesting when we think about policy. So policy is a bit of a trick. So you as a partner may well be responsible for policy for your customers. It may be part of your service offering. And you will want to do this at scale. You may be managing 50 or 100 subscriptions or more. And the only way you're going to do that is with automation. You can write automation to apply the policies, to create the policy definitions if you're using custom policies, create the policy definitions and apply them at scale across the customer subscriptions. But to do that at scale, you're basically just going to have to script it out and apply the same policy repeatedly at each subscription scope. There's no shortcut in that sense. It's like if you have been using Azure for a long time, you may remember what Azure was like before management groups were invented. And there, if you were working in enterprise across, an enterprise governance team across a large number of subscriptions, this is exactly what you did. You applied governance at scale through automation rather than through management groups. And this is kind of going back to those old days. From the MSP point of view, you can still do all this at scale. The way you do it is by automating and by rinsing and repeating. So that's how that works. And the same also applies when it comes to policy compliance. If you have the same policy applied on 50 different subscriptions, well, that means you've got 50 different compliance reports to review. You don't get to see an aggregated view. Now, you can access the compliance data programmatically, so you could do that. You could write some automation that will aggregate that data across those subscriptions and give you an aggregated view, but it's not coming for free out of Azure. You're going to have to build that as a partner yourself. That's an investment that you'd be making. The second thing here, you see all those other bullets here, policy remediation. We talked about policy remediation. It's a pretty powerful feature of Azure Policy, a fairly advanced feature. It only applies to certain policies that support remediation. And as I said, they do this using a managed identity that is created by the platform. And that managed identity needs the right permissions. So if you want to use policy remediation, this is how it works. Firstly, identify what policies you're going to use. Secondly, look at those policies and work out what permissions they need, because within the policy definition, it will list out to say, okay, I need these permissions in order to do the remediation. These are the permissions I want. Might ask for typically contributor permissions, but it may be something else. So those are the permissions you're going to need. So now as a partner within your MSP offer or within the registration definition that you're asking the customer to create, you're going to have to list out those permissions that you need. So this is in this what we call the delegated role definition IDs. Let me show you this in a template. Here we have a template that contains, this is what the customer would deploy if they're using Lighthouse, but they're not doing it from an MSP offer from the marketplace. They're just doing it from the template. So they deploy two resources. First one is the registration definition, and the second one is the registration assignment. And in this case, they're both being deployed at subscription scope. This is a sample template there's a Lighthouse GitHub repo where they have these samples, and this one is the subscription scope one. There's another one of these that does the registration assignment at the resource group level. It's just a different sample that they have. So here you can see the different registration names and so on, and the authorizations are coming from this parameter. And if I look at the parameters file, you'll see that the authorizations is this object, which is actually an array, and it shows, look, this is the principal ID. This is the person who's going to get the permissions. This could be a group or an individual who's getting the permissions. In this case, it's the security team. This is within the. This is all being deployed by the customer, but this GUID is from the MSP's tenant. And you say, this is the permission they're getting. And in this case, that's the GUID that represents the contributor role. It's the role definition ID for the contributor role. And you can look up these IDs with PowerShell easily enough. Get AZ role definition, and it will show you these GUIDs. And they've got the resource policy contributor. And for here, when you do user access administrator, you have this additional setting, delegated role definition IDs. So here you're saying, these are the permissions that the user access administrator will be able to grant. And in this case, it's the contributor permission, which you can see is actually the same as the GUID up here. So that the Contoso security team are going to be contributors, and the user access administrator, which is going to the same team, they'll be able to assign contributor permissions, and you remember they'll only be able to assign it to managed identities. So this is where you specify whichever policy you want to be able to deploy with remediation, whatever permissions that policy needs in order to do remediation, those permissions are going to have to be listed out here. Under your user access administrator, because otherwise you're not going to be able to grant permissions to the managed identity to support the remediation. Okay, so include those permissions in your MSP offer, and then obviously the customer signs up and you have the permissions you need. To grant those permissions to the managed identity requires a new version of the API version. It's this one here, 219.04.01 preview. And that is not supported through the Azure portal. So you're going to have to deploy the policy through a template. You can't do it in PowerShell, you can't do it in CLI, you're going to have to do it through a template. And there's an example template in that GitHub Lighthouse repository. You'll find that sample easily enough. And there's a documentation page that explains this. And then once you've got that deployed, then everything works as normal. Then everything is good. You can just use the policy, look at compliance reports, do a remediation, it all works. I can show you an example. Let's have a look. So here I'm in the Contoso directory. And if I go to the My Customers view, you can see on the left here, I have this My Customers view. Here, Contoso in this case is acting as the MSP, and they have been granted permission to the Fabricam directory. Look, Fabricam have signed up and said, yeah, you can, we're happy to give you permissions, and the delegations that Fabricam have given is for this particular subscription. So this customers view represents the Fabricam registration definition, and the delegations view is the registration delegations. How was this set up? Well, that was set up by Fabricam. Fabricam did that. And if I go into this other tab, now I'm in the Fabricam view. So they have simply deployed that template, exactly the one I showed you. And in the service providers, you get to see, okay, look, yeah, Contoso is my service provider, and I have one delegation at a subscription level. Let's have a look at the delegations. I click here, and here they are. If I wanted to add another delegation, I just click Add, and I can then list out here subscriptions and resource groups. I can then add those. So I choose my provider, Contoso, manage services, and I can add additional subscriptions and so on here. I only have the one subscription here, so I can't answer that question that we had earlier. If I need another registration. Okay, so you see here how this was set up. So within this particular account, within the subscription for Fabricam, the customer, if I look at the resources, you will see that they have a VNet. That's the only resource they have is this VNet. And they have Network Watcher as well. And there's no tags on this VNet. If I go into the customer view, I go into the managed service provider. I'm now in Contoso's directory, and they have access to this Fabricam. They, from their subscription filter, can decide which directories are they looking at and which subscriptions are they looking at. So here they're only interested in seeing the Fabricam subscription. So if from this view, from the Contoso directory, I click All Resources, well, the only thing I see is the test VNet that's in the Fabricam subscription. This is Lighthouse, right? This is what it's doing. I am within the context of my directory. I'm not having to switch directories. I could have 50 different providers here, providing, I can have a huge list of subscriptions here that I'm aggregating together. So I'm in Fabricam. I'm not having to do any switching around, changing my context, but just from my Contoso directory, look, I can see Fabricam stuff. Awesome. If I go into policy, let's make a change to this. So if we come in here, maybe we'll create a new resource. Let's see if we can do that. Let's just do an add networking. We'll add a load balancer. That should be fairly easy. And we're going to do it in the Fabricam. You can see here when I create a result, you can see I've got this, again, this breakdown of different subscriptions to choose, including the delegated subscription, the Fabricam subscription. We'll do it in the migration IG, and we'll just give it a name. I'm just going to accept defaults, create. Oh, we missed something. Let's go back and have a look. What did we miss? Okay, yeah, IP address name. There we go. Perfect. Okay, review and create. Great. And you can see here, that's me as a Contoso user acting within the Fabricam directory, within the Fabricam subscription. Awesome. It's underway. Load balancers should be fairly quick to deploy. So you get the idea. I have a policy that I deployed already using that method I just showed you with the template. Let me show you the template that was deployed to create that policy. That's this one. And you can see it simply lists out, a policy assignment. It's using a built-in policy definition, and the policy definition is the one for adding a tag and value to a resource. The tag name and value are specified in parameters, and the role assignment here is to enable the remediation. So this is assigning the role, in this case, the contributor role, to the managed identity of the policy, and this is because it's being deployed into the Fabricam subscription from the Contoso subscription into the customer from the managed service provider, this role assignment takes a special form where it has this parameter, the delegated managed identity resource ID, which is why we need to use this preview API version. So this is all a little bit special. This is, you copy and paste it from the sample and it works. I mean, I'm making it sound harder than it is. It's fairly straightforward. Okay, so that's happening. Let's have a look at the policy. And you can see I can look at, add tag name. This is the name of the tag, tag to resources. And this is in the Fabricam subscription. So you can see here from the Contoso directory, I'm able to look at policies at the Fabricam scope. I'm able to review their compliance. You can see here 50% compliance. I've got 2 resources, one's got the tag and one doesn't. So this is me as a partner being able to do policy compliance on behalf of my customer. Fantastic. Suppose I want to do a remediation. I can create a remediation task. And because I have the correct permissions in place, you can see here, this is the resource that's going to be remediated. If I look at that virtual network, you'll see it doesn't have the tag at the moment. There's no tags at present on here. But if I go back and say, yes, I want to remediate, it's going to create a remediation task. Let's just look at the task progress. Okay, not started, refresh. Succeeded, okay, yes, that was quick. And if I go back to my all resources, and I say, oh, God, there's my load balancer, that's appeared now. And if I look at my VNet, which a minute ago did not have the tag, well, now it does, because it's the remediation has worked. So this is all the kind of work that you can do as Contoso working within your customers' directory, within their resources. Super. Okay, that's enough on policy. Another interesting thing is the activity log. So everything is logged, and it works kind of the way you'd expect it to work. If I do something, then I expect it to be logged, and I expect it to be logged under my name. So in this case, from the customer's point of view, anything the MSP does appears in the customer's activity log. So the MSP is not kind of working in secret. The customer gets full visibility into all that activity. So let's see that. I just created a VM. I messed around with tags and so on. Let's have a look what that looks like. So here I'm in the Contoso view. So let's go back to Fabricam. So Fabricam is the customer. They've had Contoso deploy. So as Contoso, on behalf of this customer, I just deployed a load balancer, for example. Let's have a look what resources I have. If I refresh, oh look, I've now got a load balancer. Where did that come from? I might be thinking, oh, that's a load balancer IP. It's like, oh, where did they come from? I didn't do that. So I click on it and I say, okay, yeah, show me the activity log for this load balancer, because I didn't do that. And hopefully it's come through. Obviously the activity log takes a few seconds to come through the entries. Look, there they are, look, modify. And it's in my subscription. But look, event initiated by jrtlabo1 at outlook.com. So this is a Contoso identity. The outlook.com is simply because it's that's the login for this particular account in the Contoso directory. But I get to see the real name of the user here. If you obviously typically this would, rather than at outlook.com, because it's simply an Azure PaaS subscription, this will be showing JRT at Contoso.com. It's the end of the day, and it's not just the group that the user is a member of. You get to see the individual name, the individual account within that group that you gave permission to. You get to see the details of who has performed the operation. So there's no hiding as a service provider. The customer can see what you do, and they can see who does it. So as a customer, it means you do get visibility into what is going on in your subscription. The activity log still contains everything. So that's great. From the Contoso point of view, you also will want to have visibility into the resources. So if we look at this IP, for example, I can look at the activity log there. So from the Contoso directory, just wait for this to load. I can still see that yes, I can create access. If I have read permissions, so I can review the activity log on the Fabricam side, I can say yes, this was one of my staff and they were working in the Fabricam subscription. I can see this. So again, you've got visibility on both sides. This of course requires the reader role or similar within the MSP permissions that were granted as part of the delegation, but they're always going to need read permissions. So there's no sensible scenario where that wouldn't be the case. Great. And that brings me to the end. As I said, I thought we'd finish a little early. Hopefully that's given all of you a good understanding of what Lighthouse is and what it can do, and some of the tricks needed to get it set up. You have a good understanding of being able to do it through templates and through the marketplace, the permissions you need, what it's capable of, some of the limitations, and you're all excited to get hands-on with it, roll up your sleeves, and do amazing things. If there are more questions, then I'm happy to stay on the call and take those questions. And there was one question that I parked from earlier. If a customer has multiple subscriptions, do you have to deploy the resources in each subscription? The delegation, yes, and the registration, not sure. But if you ping me your email, I'll put my email back on the screen here. If you ping me an email, I'm happy to dig into that question that's something we want to unscramble there. So my email is just there on the slide. Anyone, if you think of any questions or for that particular question, do send me an email and I will get back to you with an answer on that one. Well, if there's no more questions, then I guess we'll wrap up there. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope it's been useful, and we'll see you on another one of our talks. We do deep dive talks on a whole range of topics as part of Skill Me Up. So if you have a Skill Me Up subscription, I'll probably see you on another talk on Skill Me Up at some point in the future. Otherwise, enjoy Azure. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everybody.